of EdenKeeper.org. We're a site dedicated to exploring the relationship between religion and spirituality and environmentalism. And today we're looking at the need for God to be part of the environmental discussion. So often we rely on governments and regulations and new technology breakthroughs to really do the big environmental things we want to do. We were so happy here in the United States just over a month ago when President Obama finally got through some new carbon pollution rules. And we applaud each time we see some new green technology make a breakthrough that will hopefully save us from the catastrophic changes of climate change. But David Page challenges our reliance on regulations and new technology to save the environment in his book, Godless Environmentalism. And today I'm so excited to have him here so that we can ask him some questions and get some more insights into his thoughts and his book. So David, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Robin. It's a pleasure to be here with you and Eden Keeper.
So in your book, Godless Environmentalism, you break down a lot of the assumptions that we make when we define what it means to save the environment. Can you briefly tell me about some of your motivations in writing the book?
Sure. I think that the book came about largely as a conversation I was having with myself. As you may know, I actually come from a little bit of an environmentalist background. My first job in law school was actually up in Alaska doing impact litigation under the Clean Water Act. In the wake of the Exxon Valdez oil spill and some of the mining issues that the Alaskans have had and continue to have. And so I was sort of bitten by the save the environment bug. I loved the country up there. It was beautiful, pristine wilderness. And I felt sort of a desire and a motivation to assist in the effort to preserve it as pristine wilderness. And even in that first summer, I was struck by how hard I was working, and how meager the results were under Clean Water Act regulations. And I realized very soon after working in the area in Washington, D.C., continuing my studies teaching environmental law, I realized that there seemed to be a disconnect between our aspiration to protect the planet and preserve the beauty of the planet, and which was a very noble aspiration and a very sort of far-reaching goal, and the actual results, which seemed very, very modest, if not to say in some cases almost non-existent. In other words, in areas like global warming, although cause and effect is a very difficult thing to measure, we do see that the planet is not getting cooler over time, despite all of the carbon trading, emissions trading efforts, and all of the efforts to cut greenhouse gases globally and nationally. And so I found myself asking the question increasingly, why is this not working? And after asking that question, I found myself guided, almost by an amazing set of coincidences. To the extent we're spiritual people, we believe that there may not be coincidences as such. In other words, we believe that there's a guiding power guiding us and guiding the world. And I found myself basically delving into ancient sources of wisdom, Torah sources, the Jewish Torah, and found myself actually, after living for more than a decade in Jerusalem, actually until now, about a decade at the time when the book was published, I found that basically some of the answers that I had sought, some of the answers to why things weren't working as well as might be expected, were to be found in those ancient sources. And that was really my motivation for writing the book. I had actually, just stepping back one step, a few years before, I had actually taught environmental law and policy in Jerusalem at the university there, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. and I found that I wasn't able to talk about some of what I was finding on the sort of spiritual plane, because spirituality, unlike an Eden Keeper, which really honors and explores the spiritual underpinnings of environmental protection. That's the whole basis of what your organization and your site do. In the academic setting, as you're probably aware, that recognition of the spiritual underpinnings of environmental protection has been slower in developing. And so I wasn't able to mention any of those things, and I thought to myself, well, in a book I can mention those things, and I can actually discuss the issues in the course, the shortcomings of environmental policy, and actually add that very important additional, deeper element of spirituality. So that was my motivation for writing the book.
Yeah, and that's actually what really stood out to me when I first read your book. I mean, I'm coming from the same background that you're coming from as an environmental attorney, and increasingly disillusioned with the ineffectiveness of going down that route and looking for answers beyond that. And so, yeah, the spirituality does makes more sense to me, and I think that's what really spoke to me with your book. Now, when you were studying those ancient texts, you were able to make kind of a comparison between the web of delusion that we operate under when we try to save the environment now, and the God nexus, which is kind of a more godly approach to dealing with the environment, a more spiritual approach. So can you tell me a little bit more about the theology of, where does the idea for the God nexus come from?
Certainly. In terms of the theology, I tend to understand theology as the human being's speculations, about God, whereas I think what my book tries to deal with is God's insights into human beings and our planet. so I wouldn't necessarily use the term theology to describe it, but I understand exactly what you mean. I mean, I think that basically we start going very far back with two sort of different approaches to not just to the environment, but to engaging with the world in general. And one is a more sort of connected approach, a spiritual approach to God, and the other is more of a technological, technocratic approach, if you will, the kind of approach that says basically, we as human beings, have the ability to tinker, to make a better mousetrap, to fix things properly, and by improving technology, we will solve, frankly, every problem there is, including that of environmental degradation. And in the book, as I discuss, that approach goes back to very ancient roots. The roots discussed in the book of Genesis, the conflict between Esau, who represents the more technological, technocratic approach. He was a hunter. He was a person of great physical power. He was a person who was very engaged and enamored excuse me, with the technical physical world. And on the other hand, Jacob, who was a more spiritual person, and whose goal was to essentially engage with God and understand how God engages with the world, essentially reconnect the world to God. So these are the two approaches. Now, how that plays out in the particular context of environmental protection. Sorry, we're getting a little wind out here on the west coast. How that particularly relates to environmental protection. Under the technological approach, we tend to look at environmental protection as just simply a challenge that can be solved by technical means. So, for example, if there's a problem with clean energy, we just find a new energy source. And we've moved very far over the past couple centuries, from whale blubber, as a source of light and heat to, coal. And we all know the problems with whale blubber and coal. Whale blubber leading to species extinction, coal leading to, both degradation of rivers and landscapes, the famous slag heap, and on the other hand, tremendous air pollution, even with cleaner coal technologies. And then we move from coal to issues like solutions like nuclear power. Obviously nuclear power in recent years has not had the best name recognition from the environmental community. It's it's not considered the safest or cleanest or most sustainable solution, and so things have moved from there to newer technologies like fracking, which for a while seemed very very nice. Everything occurs underground. The problem is there's tremendous pollution of the groundwater, and stuff seeps up, and it creates some toxic hazards. Sorry. We're dealing with a lot of wind. Maybe let me just take a break for one moment.
Sure. I can speak to this while you're putting your yourself together. I just wanted to add on what David was saying, because this is something that I saw when I was practicing environmental law. It was that kind of, that there was no really good energy source. We were kind of moving from one energy source to another with no, almost kind of blindly. And here, I'll let you take it back.
Okay, thank you. So, essentially, these technical approaches, they haven't been successful over time. In other words, what you've had. This is one of those moments that they show in outtakes in the film industry. Okay, so let me compose myself for a moment. I hope we can edit this part out. I don't know if we can.
No editing.
No editing.
We're live.
Okay, fine. So basically, to try to solve these problems by a technical approach hasn't worked, and what the reason is because basically every new technology, creates its new challenges, and every wonderful solution turns out to have some problems as well. Even wind power, as you're aware in California, it comes with a lot of building, a lot of land use, a lot of need for farmland to be used for wind farms, and it just changes the landscape, and obviously other sort of nature-powered solutions like water power have dealt to species extinction. A lot of changes, very, very sort of devastating changes to ecosystems. The Grand Coulee Dam, the Aswan Dam in Egypt, and so obviously solar comes with its own challenges. The challenge of essentially producing solar energy at a very high rate, and so what you see is basically these technical fixes aren't stopping the basic challenge. Sorry, we might have to start this again.
Well, it just goes to show the power of the wind power, right?
That's right. Yeah. Anyhow, so essentially, this desire for a technical fix runs into problems again and again, and that's where we're caused to sort of stop and think and reach out, because there is a power which created this planet and continues to maintain the planet, and actually, according to the Torah, the very purpose of looking into nature, is to sort of discover that power and to reach out to that power, and to connect to the power, and so. you know, that very failure becomes a source of tremendous, spiritual creativity and motivation, to get to the spiritual roots of the environmental uh, protection issue. So I mean that is basically the dichotomy, between the what I term in the book the world of delusion, and what the book calls the God nexus. Nexus being a connection to God and the divine. Now, in ancient Hebrew, the word for the world, which is olam, comes from the same root as hiddenness, which is helam, something which is removed and essentially does not appear to the naked eye. In other words, the very root of the word that's in ancient Hebrew that means world, contains within it this aspect of hiddenness, this need for discovering, the spiritual source, and so that is essentially the project of spiritual environmentalism, from the point of view of the book that I wrote.
Yeah, and you covered a lot there. I mean, I think that there's that theology, then there's it goes to show the technologies and how we can't really rely on that. And I think that to me, you dedicated a big portion of the book to kind of deconstructing this web of delusion that we operate under now. And to me, that was actually, that was just a very provocative part of the book, because it really made apparent to me the kind of delusions that I was operating under and just kind of the assumptions I was making when I term it arrogance. You might term it humility, but when I try to save the environment. And so, can you go into some of these the basic traps we fall into with the web of delusion?
Sure. I mean, the biggest trap, I think, is one that we've discussed already, which is, sort of buying into this blind faith in technological solutions, to very complex problems. Because, as we know, Robin, the world is an extremely intricate, complex place. Even the concept of a species, from a genetic point of view, is such an intricate concept that scientists have trouble often, defining, where one species ends and another begins. In other words, there's just such, depth and complexity. Also defining an ecosystem, what's in the ecosystem and what's out of the ecosystem. This is a very, very complex thing because everything is interrelated, and it's hard to know, with the web of cause and effect, the butterfly effect. It's hard to know, if we technologically push a button, on one aspect of the problem, what's going to happen, in a completely different aspect. And we see again and again, that in regulatory regimes like the Endangered Species Act in the United States, we have trouble even monitoring, whether the species is thriving or endangered, or in fact, what is happening. In other words, just the data collection aspect is so challenging, and so I mean there tends to be in the web of delusion approach, this constant reliance on technical fixes. And if you listen to the way the policy debate runs in political circles, you hear very, very definite statements. If we do this, this will happen, and if we do that, that will happen. And we know that the cause and effect, the butterfly effect, the famous butterfly effect, where a butterfly, flaps its wings in the Gulf of Mexico, and that very minuscule event causes a tremendous ripple effect, which could lead to a hurricane. I mean, the butterfly effect is just an example, but really, it's a particularly illustrative, dramatic example of something that goes on all the time. In other words, butterflies are just one small, factor, affecting the entire web of causation. And so, this blind faith, if you will, almost a religious, faith in technology and technological progress and a we can attitude, what you've termed we can do, what you've termed arrogance, is the first trap that people tend to fall into. And once you've fallen into that, it could be that you'll constantly run after that technological solution without ever, sort of looking beyond. And usually it's when you realize that technology only goes so far, that it's possible to then connect to the spiritual. And that is, so that is the first trap. Is this, technology-centric approach, which tends to leave out any ability to increase the bandwidth to consider other aspects. Now, the other aspect is, of course, to turn to the spiritual, to turn to God. As everybody knows, as you know, this is a very, very deep and complex effort. In other words, it's very easy to sort of invoke, the name of God, for one purpose or another, and to come up with, terrible solutions. I mean, obviously in ancient times, people talked about God to justify human sacrifice, and all kinds of, terrible practices. To this day, we understand that not everybody who invokes, the divine is necessarily interested in protecting and saving the world. In fact, on the contrary, you see some very destructive behaviors. So I guess the second trap is, finding, that spiritual path, which is a genuine effort to connect the world to God and reconnect the world to God. That, for me, as a Jewish person, that way is through the Torah and its teachings. So I guess I guess you could describe one trap as being more of a sort of anti-spiritual trap, and the other is sort of more insidious, and that's the sort of pseudo-spiritual trap, which is not really spiritual, but it pretends to be so.
Yeah, that's actually a really, really important point to make. On my site, I track a lot of what the religious right and groups like the Cornwall Alliance try to use God for in terms of environmental destruction and other kind of harmful policies. So, you didn't go into too many practical steps in your book on how we can make a more godly connection to the environment. But can you briefly discuss kind of the application of your idea as much as you can?
Sure. I mean, in a half-an-hour webinar, obviously there are certain limitations, but the basic idea is that when we see an environmental issue, our first move is not to run to find the latest technological solution, but understand essentially that God is having a conversation with us, and to sort of look at that particular issue in a spiritual context. So, how do we concretize that? It sounds great, but how is that concretized in practice? So, for example, taking the issue we mentioned, global warming. We understand that the mechanism of heat is, to some extent, a mechanism, which symbolizes, according to ancient Torah sources, symbolizes an aspect of judgment, an aspect of essentially a seeming, withholding of God's presence in the world, and that causes, essentially a heating up. Now we understand, that the element that's being heated up, which is air, also has its spiritual counterpart. Air, which is one of the most, ethereal, one of the most, sort of intangible yet most important, aspects of our existence in the world, corresponds to, that intangible but extremely important and all-encompassing, pure will of God, and it's that that very thing which is heating up. So we from a Torah perspective, we understand that the ancient sages tell us that in the oral law that basically the world stands on three pillars. One is acts of human kindness, that is acts essentially towards one another, being good to one another, but not in ways which are only seemingly good, but truly, in a deep way, caring for and being good to one another. So that's one pillar. Another pillar is serving God. Serving God and recognizing ourselves as His servants, as His basically, His vehicles in the world to, affect a spiritual connection between, Him and the world He created. And the third is understanding, the will of God for the world, and that as Jews we understand as being, Torah. So essentially, I mean, we have to look at each environmental problem, as an expression of one of these pillars being somehow out of balance, and basically understanding exactly how by looking at the element, in detail, which is out of balance. In other words, not satisfying ourselves with sort of a superficial, in God we trust. Yes, everything is attributable to God, and so it must be God acting in the world. That may be true, but it's not particularly helpful because it's too general. In other words, it doesn't provide any guidance, for real concrete situations. So this kind of spiritual environmentalism, that I set forth in Godless Environmentalism, is that very sort of concretized, very specific and detail-oriented approach to understanding environmental problems as a dialogue between the human being and God as expressed in the world that He created and that He continues to maintain.
Yeah. So, I mean, I just thought the book was beautiful, and it had a huge impact on me in making my decision even to start EdenKeeper.org. And so I highly recommend that people pick up the book, give it a read, and find out if you agree with it or not. It's up to you. So we did have some questions that came in. The first is from Randy, and she wants to know about the balance between acting spiritually and reducing the harmful effects. So kind of like the balance between a spiritual approach and regulation slash technology slash personal involvement.
Right. So I mean, first of all, let me take a step back and thank you, because it means a lot that you connected to the book. I appreciate the it meant something, and I realize for the people listening, there may be people who have questions, comments, issues, who actually disagree with various aspects of the book and its conclusions. And I truly encourage debate. In other words, I welcome those kinds of questions. So anybody who does have those kinds of questions, I definitely would appreciate hearing from you. Either via the book's website or Facebook or Twitter or via EdenKeeper, frankly. You're welcome to comment. I'm not sure. With regard to the question that was posed, I'm not sure I understood. In other words, the question is about the spiritual, connection between the environment. Sorry. Could you?
So how can you have a godly approach to the environment? What is the balance between supporting regulation, taking personal involvement in protecting the environment, and also kind of trusting in God, and having this conversation with God? How can you balance the two?
I see. Right. Sure. I mean, this is a very important question. Obviously, it's easy to make a mistake and say that basically faith and spirituality mean that, we as human beings have to do absolutely nothing, and all we have to do is really, you know, put our hands together and pray to God, and that is all, that we really have to do in life, and really, as long as we do that, we're done, and that is not the approach, taken by the book, or indeed, on a more broader scale, that's not the approach that the Torah takes to spirituality. In other words, a purely intellectual, purely spiritual approach, that basically does not have any sort of practical action, and no sort of practical consequence associated with it, is something which is considered essentially without merit, according to the Torah. So the idea is to not ignore the spiritual side, rather to connect to the spiritual side, and by doing so, that should really elevate and affect a human being, on all levels, on levels of action, on levels of thoughts. In other words, the nature of the person, who is connected to God, changes, and so too do that person's understanding of how to regulate, of how to preserve, of how to protect, and that is so that is the aspiration of the spiritual approach. In other words, it is not somehow to lead a purely abstract existence, which is an existence of the mind and the heart alone, but rather action is very important.
So the next question from Alexandra kind of deals a little bit more with action too. She wants to know about the relationship between care for the earth and the concept of tikkun. So we seem to have lost David, but he is available to answer questions, like he said, on Facebook. He has a Facebook account for Godless Environmentalism. He also has a Twitter account for Godless Environmentalism and a website. So I encourage you all to go check that out. Here at Eden Keeper, you can reach him through comments on this post. And he is more than willing to answer more questions and respond. So I encourage you all to do that. Definitely check out the book. And thank you so much for your time.